My name is Amar Mukunda. Yeah, my dad is from India, from Karnataka. My mom is from Karachi, from Pakistan. My parents met here in Maryland. So I grew up here, and like a lot of South Asian families, like a lot of immigrant families, my parents started a company, were small business owners, and then they were very fortunate. That company grew, and they were very successful. And then when I was 9 years old, their company went bankrupt. And our family lost everything. So I grew up in Montgomery County, but I moved 8 times within the county before I graduated high school. So I got to see the best and worst of what our part of Maryland has to offer, and got an understanding of, the trials and struggles that so many families go through in this country. Yeah. So
Let's list
yes,
that out.
yeah, I graduated from the public schools here, but I actually didn't change schools. So even though I was moving a lot, we didn't change schools, even though we didn't always live in the right district for the school. So I graduated from an amazing public high school called Walt Whitman,
Oh, wonderful.
which is just a wonderful school, and I felt so lucky to be able to go there.
And which of the middle school you did?
Which middle school? I went to Pyle.
Okay.
Yes.
And do you remember the
Elementary school, I went to Carter Springs Elementary School. Before that, Montessori, I went to Montessori school called Apple Montessori School, which was a great, great little Montessori school. So when I graduated from high school, I went to Amherst College, which is a small liberal arts college in Western Massachusetts. I studied computer science and geology at Amherst College. And while I was there, I started a company that I then sold to a friend who I started that company with, and then did a Fulbright research grant in machine learning and AI. That was 2016.
Yes.
So it's interesting. I mean, I remember a lot of different parts of Montgomery County from being a kid. I remember Lake Forest Mall very well. Spent a lot of time there. I remember my dadima, my grandmother, had a house in Silver Spring that we spent so much time there whenever my parents were out of town. So yeah, I mean, I I love Montgomery County. It's a really wonderful part of the country. It's a really amazing place. The thing that I remember, honestly, more than anything else, is I remember growing up feeling like we were incredibly lucky to live in Montgomery County, and that it was one of the best places in the world to live. I remember feeling like our public schools were as good as any in the country. I remember, especially being in high school, feeling like, Walt Whitman was the best public school in the world, and it was as good as any schools in Northern Virginia. I don't necessarily feel that way anymore.
No?
Unfortunately, I don't necessarily feel that we in Montgomery County have kept up with, say, Northern Virginia when it comes to our public infrastructure, when it comes to, access to jobs, even when it comes to public schools. I think we're definitely still are an amazing place, but I think there are a lot of things that have fallen behind in the county, and that's part of why I'm very excited to be serving the state senate
So
starting
tell
next
me,
year. So it's interesting. So my parents were, I would say, very non-political for most of my childhood growing up, and then in 2007, I guess that was 2008, President Obama ran for office, and that completely changed my view and my interest in life. I started volunteering for his campaign. I volunteered for the 2008 Obama campaign. I was the Montgomery County High School coordinator for the Obama campaign. So my job was to help recruit high school students from around the county to knock on doors for the Obama campaign. And because I got so interested in it, I think my parents also started becoming much more actively involved and much more interested in politics as well. And they were always super encouraging. They were always super encouraging with not just, getting involved in politics at that time or now, but with anything that I did. That was really the first thing that got me interested or excited about politics, was seeing him run. And then I would say I kind of left it aside. It was always something I cared about. It was always an interest, but I then, I studied computer science and geology and worked in the technology space. So it was not really front and center for me in terms of my interests from, say, college to a few years out. And then everything completely changed for me in early 2019. I lost somebody very close to me to addiction. And that, basically because of that, I left the technology world and started working for a very small gun violence and addiction prevention program. So we were working with a lot of young people who, were really struggling, trying to help them get their GEDs, trying to help them overcome addiction, trying to help them, find jobs. And through that work, which was really direct community service work, working with young people on the street, mostly Baltimore City, but also here in Montgomery County, Hagerstown, different parts of the state. Through that work, I started to get more involved in the Maryland political space and advocating for gun violence prevention laws in Maryland, in particular something called Maryland Violence Intervention Prevention Program Fund. And that really got me more interested in state government and the advocacy process. And I think that's a big part of what led to me doing this now. It's interesting. I mean, you risk your time, you risk your effort, you risk, asking people to support something and believe in something that may not work out. But ultimately, the bigger risk is letting things stay the way they are. Because what's happening now is just completely unacceptable. I think in the US, we're sliding away from democracy into a more authoritarian system. It's becoming harder and harder for people to own their own businesses, to own their own homes. Everything's becoming unaffordable, and government is not acting with the speed that is required to address these challenges. And so, yes, there's a risk when you take an action like that, but there's also just as much risk, if not more risk, in just letting things continue to be the way that they are. I think very few people felt that it was possible for us to win when we started. But the nice thing is that there's no polls because the race is too small. So on day one, if they had done a poll, they would have seen I'm at 0% and she's at 100%.
Right.
And everybody said, oh, why we even bother? But I could say, oh, there's no poll, there's no poll. I keep running and keep working and build the support from there. So, it's not so much believing in yourself as it's seeing what to me felt very obvious, which is that even if somebody has been in office for a long time, even if there's the Senate majority leader, the status quo is not acceptable. And unfortunately, what's happened in Annapolis is that the state Senate in particular, but the state government as a whole, has become, I think, insulated from the challenges that people are facing every day in some ways. And so there's just a lack of getting things done. And a simple example is, people taking money from corporations and lobbyists, right? It's a simple thing, but everybody knows that utility bills are going up. Everyone knows that healthcare costs are going up. But so many of our legislators are continuing to take money from utility companies and healthcare companies while having the job responsibility of writing laws and legislation that are supposed to help protect us and lower our costs. It's such an obvious conflict of interest that any person walking down the street, if you say to them, hey, look, I'm running for state Senate, I'm not taking any corporate or lobbyist money, I don't think politicians should be taking that. And oh, by the way, the utility companies and the healthcare companies in particular who are driving up your costs are two of the largest contributors to our state legislators. Don't you think it's time for us to change how we do things? Most people are going to say, of course. So I filed in November of last year, but I had started obviously meeting with people and understanding how to build a campaign and exploring and figuring it out before then. But filed in early November, and that's when we officially started, campaigning and running for office. Yeah.
And how did you campaign? You went, knocked on the
Oh
doors,
yeah.
you went to meetings?
Oh yeah. So a lot of campaigning is
Yeah.
knocking on doors. It sounds very silly,
Yeah.
but a lot of campaigning is knocking on doors, because you can go to a lot of community meetings and you can meet people at those things, but if you want to have time to talk to people one-on-one, knocking on doors is the best way. So I think we knocked on, I don't know how many tens of thousands of doors, but it was a lot. And just mostly I spent my time doing that, knocking on doors, going to people's houses, introducing myself, asking people for their... It's funny because I think the vast majority of the time, people don't open the door.
Yeah,
So,
right.
so,
You see any stranger
so yeah, so 75% of the time you're knocking on the door, nobody's even gonna answer.
okay.
Within that 25% of the time when people answer the door,
Yeah.
it's a mix, right? A lot of the time people are very respectful and they say, oh, I'm cooking dinner, I'm busy, but I'll take your paper, I'll read about it. Fine. Sometimes you'll get people who are willing to have a conversation with you, and that is the most rewarding and amazing part of campaigning, because when you meet somebody who says, I have never spoken to an elected official before, nobody who's running for office has ever come to my door and asked for my vote, this is amazing, that's really impactful, because you're bringing democracy to people's doorsteps and you're making government accessible to people. I think I met folks who, I met a very large range of people, but I met a lot of people who would say, nobody who's running for office has ever come to my house before. Please come in. Come sit and have tea with me, have a meal. I had one family, I knocked on their door, they were having dinner.
Yeah.
And they literally brought me inside and I had a plate of food with them at their dinner table,
Yeah.
with the wife, the father, and the son. And the three of us the four of us were talking. It was amazing, there's a lot of really wonderful people and stories from just knocking on doors. I knocked on doors in the middle of winter when it was super, super cold out, big hoodie,
Right.
and people gave me, hot tea, and they told me to come inside. I knocked on doors in the rain, and somebody gave me an umbrella because it was getting rained on. Somebody else gave me a bag of bananas. I knocked on door in the heat, and people gave me water bottles. People are really, really, really kind and nice. Once in a while, you get somebody cusses you out, and why are you here? Get off my property. But that, I don't think it was ever because of the color of my skin.
Okay.
I don't think it was ever because of the color of my skin. That plays much more of a role online, where I think people either there's a lot of bots that are fake accounts or people
Right.
who are not real people, and so it makes it look like there's more hatred than there is, because that creates more engagement. So I think a lot of that hatred online is racialized, but it's hard to tell how much of that is real versus fake. Some of it is definitely real, but in person, it's more, honestly, I think over time as a culture, we've just become more and more isolated, and people are struggling. They have bills to pay. They got a lot of stress, and we've gotten more and more used to spending time on our devices, not talking to people. And so when somebody shows up at the door, it takes them out of their comfort zone, or adds to their daily stress. And so, that can be part of it. And, once in a while, it's also, people are just having a really bad day and having a really hard time. I actually, this person was very, very kind to me, but I knocked on somebody's door whose husband had passed away the day before, and she was, obviously very sweet, and we had a nice conversation, but people are going through things, and when you show up at somebody's house, you're in their space, and you don't know what's going on, so you just have to be respectful. If somebody's having a hard time, they don't want to talk to you, you leave. So there's the most important issues for people are definitely the cost of living, for sure, whether that's healthcare, utility bills, or housing, but just the costs. The second, for sure was schools. And then the third, I would say, especially in my community, in my district, would probably be the combination of lack of jobs and lack of accessible, transit. So the fact that most of the jobs are down county or in DC, and the fact that 270 has so much congestion, those two things together are a big, big frustration for people. But underlying all of those things is our democratic institutions, is underlying the fact that our democracy isn't working or delivering. And so whether it's the cost of living or the fact that we can't get public infrastructure built, or the fact that we're struggling to fund our schools appropriately, all of that comes back to making sure our democratic processes are functioning better. So I'm on the ballot in November. But the general election does not have a Republican opponent filed. So I'm on the ballot, but frankly, even though there's not a Republican opponent filed, there is still a lot of organizing work in the community to do, because frankly, I think people think that the way a democracy works is that you vote for somebody and it's their job to go to the legislature and fight for you. And that's it. You vote, you fulfilled your civic duty, you can move on with your life. Unfortunately, that model or that way of democracy function is long gone. It doesn't work that way, and it will never work that way again if it ever did. And so I think what we now have is a much more participatory form of democracy, where if you want to get something done for your community, voting is not enough and electing the right person is not enough. You have to vote. You have to organize with that elected official. You have to get your community engaged. You have to write letters. You have to make phone calls. You have to call other elected officials. You have to testify on the bills. You have to actually be much more involved in the entire process to get to the point where legislation gets passed, because in the space between somebody winning an election and a piece of legislation passing, there's so many special interests that come in and interfere with the legislative process that if the regular citizens are not involved or at the table, no matter how many times we elect the right person, we won't get the results that we need. And so now is really a time when we're trying to focus on getting the community organized and getting people re-engaged so that they understand that, okay, this is a two-way street. You voted for me to deliver on A, B, C, and D. I need your help to make sure that those things actually get done. Because at this point, it's all about results. It's not about anything other than how do we make sure we're getting legislation passed that makes a difference in people's lives. And that is not something that can be accomplished by one person alone. So that's what we're going to use the next few months, the general election, to focus on organizing so that we're prepared for January. So a few different areas. The first one is what I call reclaiming our democracy. Basically changing rules and laws so that our democratic system can work better. One example is getting corporate money out of politics. Hawaii is the first state in the nation that's passed a very interesting comprehensive law that works around Citizens United to try and eliminate that influence. I want Maryland to, build off of that model and find a way to really reform the amount of money that's coming into our political process, because it's extremely corrupting. And even if it's not corrupting, it creates the appearance of corruption, which is a big part of what led, for example, to Donald Trump. People saying, oh, all these politicians, they don't care about you. They just take all this money and then they don't want to do anything. That is why so many people are willing to burn the system down. And if, as Democrats, we don't listen to the music and figure out what's going on and get that money out of our political system, we're going to continue to slide as a country into authoritarianism. So it's that. It's making our primaries open for everybody. Because right now in Maryland, if you're not a registered Democrat or a registered Republican, you're not allowed to vote in the June elections in a way that is meaningful, and that's very unfair. It's getting to ranked choice voting, for example, to make sure that spoiler candidates don't end up determining the outcome of an election, and we create a system that allows more people to be able to vote. So more people to be able to run and participate in our democracy without, that ending up being something that destroys the outcomes of those elections. So things that fix our democracy, that's one bucket. Second bucket is things that lower the cost of living for people. I frankly, I think the healthcare system in the US is a complete disaster. We are spending so much money relative to peer nations and getting much worse outcomes that at this point, we really need some very dramatic reform in our healthcare system. And so I'm interested in helping Maryland to become the first state in the nation to have a true universal healthcare system. And I think that starts with reforming Medicaid, because there is a lot of research now that shows that there's a ton of waste in the Medicaid system, in particular, getting rid of managed care organizations from our Medicaid system so that we can, lower costs for the state in Medicaid. And then as we reform healthcare more broadly, lower costs for families, lower costs for businesses, lower costs for states, lower costs for counties. Everybody can save money, and it's not about ideology. It's about having better outcomes for lower costs. And if people are concerned about Maryland's business competitiveness, how we're attracting companies, being able to lower healthcare costs for people, for companies that want to hire individuals, is going to make us more competitive. So I think it's high time that we do that. There's a lot of stuff on the energy side as well that we need to be doing to lower our utility bills and bring clean energy onto the grid. Those are the two biggest focus areas for me to start. And then there's other really important things, like I really want to work on either making MARC two-way all day or extending the red line to Germantown so that we can deal with some of that traffic that is just such a big problem on 270, and also work on how we can make small business ownership, home ownership more accessible to people and attract, higher paying jobs to Montgomery County. So those are some of the big priority areas. It's a lot of work, which is why we need people to get involved. So yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that is in many ways what my election was about, because people are so fed up, and it is a huge problem for the Democratic Party. I don't think a lot of Democrats who are loyal, lifetime Democrats, and a lot of Democrats who are elected officials really understand the scope of the problems that the Democratic Party is facing right now. And it's young people, it's people of faith, it's minority communities, it's everyone who really feels the Democratic Party needs to change. So I think there's a few things. The first is the Democratic Party has to be the party of democracy. We have to be the party that believes that every vote counts, that elections should be fair, that corporate money should not influence our politics, that maps should not be gerrymandered, that the basic institutions of a democracy should be working, and that it's unacceptable for those things to be captured by special interest groups. And so the Democratic Party should be clean, right? That, I think, is number one, because if we're not clean, if we're taking money from all these big companies, nobody's going to believe anything else we have to say. So I think that is really the first step. The second step, I would say, is that there's a lot of room for diversity of opinion within the Democratic Party, and there's a lot of room, I think, for different economic theories and views. But I would say the Democratic Party should be the party of ownership. We should be the party that is saying to people, we want to make it easy for you to own your own home, for you to own your own small businesses, for you to be able to actually thrive in our state, in our county, in our country, because that's what most people want. Most people want to have a stake in the ground. They don't want to be a renter for life. They don't want to be, an employee for life. They want to own something real. And so there are many different forms of ownership. Ownership doesn't have to look like one thing, but I think we should be the party of ownership. I think, you know, for me, equity means ownership, right? So I think that's really important. And then the third thing is we should be the party of getting stuff done right now. And that's where I think someone like Mamdani is really, I mean, he's showing people that you don't have to take forever to do basic things that government should do, like filling bottles. We can get these things moving.
Right.
And I think that, like, we have to be the party that is saying, like, we can build big projects, we can make big changes, we can get stuff done quickly. We have to be the party of action, I would say. So those would be three principles, and then within that, there's a lot of scope. You know, people are going to have different views on different issues. Different things are going to work in different districts. That's okay, right? I think we shouldn't be so, you know, oh, this person's a socialist, they can't be in the Democratic Party. This person, you know, is too focused on economic development. They're a closet Republican. I don't think any of that makes sense. I think as long as people are clean and they're actually working for voters and not for special interest groups, as long as they're trying to get some big stuff done and are rooted in, like, making sure the middle class can function well, that's what it's about for me. I mean, you know, there's always going to be a back and forth like this between
Right.
Republicans and Democrats, right?
Right.
There's always going to be, they're trying to paint us with certain brush, we're trying to paint them with a certain brush. That's politics. You know, that's part of the game of politics and campaigning, is defining your opponent, and making sure that people see what you want them to see in your opponent. I don't think it's going to work. You know, I don't think that's going anywhere. I think people, frankly, don't really care whether an idea is libertarian or liberal or conservative or whatever it is. They care whether or not their healthcare costs too much. And I don't care. Like, I don't care whether an idea is where it comes from on the spectrum. I care whether it works or not. I care whether or not it's going to deliver real results for people. And I think, you know, if Democrats are campaigning on universal health care and the fact that European countries pay like half as much as we do and have better outcomes, and we are wasting our money and our resources, and people are actually dying and getting sick because we're unwilling to stand up to special interests, I think that's, you know, like,
Tell me, every president
something that has to
last
happen.
3
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So in my opinion, there's two reasons. Three big reasons. One is special interest groups, which we've talked about plenty. You know, I think these pharma companies, that health insurance companies, they're massive donors, right? And so they give a lot of money, and, you know, they give money to protect their profits, and that's one piece of what keeps the system stuck. The second is that healthcare, like a lot of things, really requires, in my opinion, a level of, like, putting the community as a whole first. It requires saying, we're all going to be in this together, and we're not going to exclude one group or another, and it's got to be everyone, because it's insurance. You have to pull risk. You have to bring everyone in to, you know, one tent. And I think because there's so much social, racial, religious, cultural, regional division in this country, there's always, well, I don't want those people. I don't want those people. Well, why should I pay for them? And I think that makes it harder. But the third one is that our democracy is set up to enable incremental change more than it enables revolutionary change. So democratic institutions are designed in a lot of ways, in this country in particular, I would say, to make it easy for you to tinker with systems in small ways and make changes, but not take big jumps. And unfortunately, healthcare is one of those things where you need a big jump. You actually have to go from point A to point Z. You can't, you can figure out some incremental steps, but there've got to be really some big transformational changes that happen. And I think we as a country haven't yet figured out how to really do that. But I think we're starting to, and I think that's very exciting. I think there's much more consciousness being raised around this issue and other issues, and I think the population as a whole has become much more comfortable with, we got to take big action. We got to make really big steps. We're not in a position where we can just play it safe and a little bit of changes here and there are going to be okay. So I think there's some underlying things that have changed that will hopefully move the needle on healthcare. But yeah, it's a challenge. But I will say, Maryland has made progress on healthcare, but there are other states that are clearly doing better than we are. And so that's where, for me as a state legislator, I can point to, yes, okay, healthcare reform is always challenging, but look at Connecticut. They've already eliminated managed care organizations in their Medicaid system. The research suggests that if we just do the same thing as them, we would save $300 to $500 million a year for our state budget. I'm not inventing anything new. I'm just saying it's already been done. Let's try it. Look at Washington State. Look at Massachusetts. Look at Oregon. Plenty of other states are doing things that are very innovative in healthcare that I think Maryland can just copy to get to the front line. So we're not in a space in Maryland where we can say, oh, we've done everything we can. No, there's other states who are doing plenty more than we are, and so there's a lot of room for improvement. Oh, this is going to be very controversial. A very controversial question. I have a lot of empathy for the MAGA movement. I have a lot of empathy for the MAGA movement because I think there are a lot of basic frustrations that people who are MAGA voters have that are not being addressed. And those basic frustrations are obviously being mixed with racial hatred and fear of outside groups and fear of immigrant groups and, a lot of underlying dark currents in American culture that have always been there, that are nothing new, that I think a lot of people feel like those things were dealt with and handled and they were gone. That was never my experience. My experience in life was never that America was over its racism in the 1990s and 2000s and Trump brought it back. It was always there. He combined that with deep economic frustrations that are frankly shared by everyone, shared by Democrats and Republicans. The MAGA movement, I think, in large part was built on the idea that Democrats and Republicans, like corporate Democrats or middle, whatever you want to call them, and kind of Bush era Republicans sold out working people and sold out regular Americans, and that's kind of the reality. Like that's pretty much what has happened. And so I have a lot of empathy for folks who feel like their economic world has been turned upside down and they need a real solution to that, and they want government to take bold and decisive action to make those changes. The problems I have are obviously with that being targeted at immigrants or targeted at racial hatred and policies that are just so juvenile that they could never work. Like build a wall. It's like build a wall. It's like people are going to get a ladder. Like really, you think that's an immigration policy? Like it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But in the age of social media, in the age of big corporate spending, it's not that signifies the MAGA movement. It's the fact that people are just really hurting and the American economic system is not working for people. And so I have a lot of empathy for that part of it. The racial hatred, the destruction of our democratic norms, the unbelievably vile aspects of Trump himself as an individual. I have no patience for any of those things, and they have to go. But MAGA did not invent racism. Um, I have no idea.
Okay.
I have no idea. But I think that the person who should be the nominee for president is the person who can prove that they have done the biggest things that really make a real difference in people's lives. The nominee should be somebody who doesn't take corporate or lobbyist money, does not bow to special interests, and can say, other people are talking about A, B, and C. I actually did A, B, and C, and here's the proof. Other people are talking about, universal health care. I actually built the first universal healthcare system in the country. Other people are talking about, clean energy and lowering your utility bills. I actually did it. Whoever in the next 2 years is able to do that, that's who's going to have my vote. And, we'll see.
What do you see Mamdani or how he has done in the New York City?
So I don't follow New York that closely. I don't know too much about the details of what he's done, but it's very clear to me that like the excitement and energy and enthusiasm